World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of Admiral distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards.
American troops on Leyte Island in the Philippines now hold Tacloban, the island's capital, its airfield, and the town of Bulag, 20 miles to the south. The Russians have made new progress in Hungary and in East Prussia. In Western Europe, General Patton's Third Army is on the attack. In the Aegean, the British have landed on the island of Lemnos. And now, news direct from correspondents abroad. For our first report, Admiral takes you to Pacific Fleet Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
According to reports from the Philippines, the operation is proceeding nicely, with the capital of Leyte Island, Tacloban, and its important 6,000-foot airstrip now in our possession. Reports from the Philippines reveal at least 2 veteran Pacific Fleet warships, the California and the Pennsylvania, taking part. It's rare that Pacific Fleet ships are mentioned by name during the operation in which they're taking part, but now that the word's out, it gives me a chance to tell a story. The California and the Pensy, you recall, were among the ships damaged in the Pearl Harbor attack. The boys call the Pensy Old Falling Apart because she turns up such a volume of gunfire you'd think she was falling to pieces. Actually, she's solid and sound, although one of the oldest U.S. battle wagons. Recently, in a Pacific bombardment action, somebody yelled at me, "Come here and look. The old Pensy's hit and she's on fire." It turned out the old gal shoots so fast and so much that at times she really does look like she's afire. Incidentally, I think this same explosive glare made by some of our warship's own guns has fooled more than one Jap airplane pilot into thinking the ship was burning furiously. All of us who were at Pearl Harbor on that now famous day have a special feeling for the ships that hit the bottom. We watch them come up and go out to do battle. The old ladies, they call them. They're broad-beamed and they're too slow to keep up with the new glamour girls of the fleet, but what sweethearts they are for bombardment. I lived on one during 3 days of most intense bombardment. It would amaze you if I could tell you the number of 14-inch shells she hurled in 3 days. When we got through firing, she'd hurled so much steel and explosives, she's ridden a good foot in the water, which is quite a lot for a battleship. This same old wagon is down hitting the Philippines. They go from one bombardment to another, and it's all in the year's work to her crew. When I learned they were going down to hit the Philippines, I said with some excitement that it would be a great show. Said the executive officer, "Yep, just as a farmer might talk about plowing up the south 40 acres, we got another job of work to do." From the reports, it looks like they did a great job. I expect one of these times in the future when the word is passed that Tokyo will be bombarded, the men of the old battleships will pat the gun turrets and say, "Well, it looks like we got another job of work to do." This is Webley Edwards at Fleet Headquarters, Pearl Harbor. I return you to Admiral in New York.
And now, for a summary of the situation on Europe's Eastern Front, Admiral takes you to Supreme Allied Headquarters in France. Larry Lasser reporting.
Night has fallen over Paris, and the wet chill of European autumn has filled the dark streets. Jeeps and trucks with headlights blazing are rushing through the blacked-out streets of Paris, heading for the front, where Supreme Allied Headquarters reports a quickening of the fighting tempo. With the American wedge and the Siegfried Line now securely anchored at Aachen, the British front in Holland has stepped up its activity for the first time since the lull following the British paratroop stand at Arnhem. Today, British infantry launched a fair-sized attack against the dug-in Germans holding the canal-riddled country between the 2 big Dutch rivers, the Waal and the Lek, as the Rhine is called in Holland. The British Second Army's 2 simultaneous attacks gained from 1,500 to 2,000 yards since early this morning. This attack was not supported in a big way from the air, and it cannot be called an offensive. It looks as though the British are heading for the Dutch road junction of Hertogenbosch, whose capture would put the British Army in a more favorable position for large-scale efforts. Right now, the ground in northern Europe is soaked and muddy, especially in Holland. It's not suitable for large-scale military operations that demand coordination between infantry, tanks, and air force. You know, early autumn is Europe's rainy season, and it may be 2 or 3 weeks before the ground is dried out and hardened by frost, and before the skies are clear enough for sustained action by our Air Force. Meantime, The 9th U.S. Air Force is making the area between the Siegfried Line and the Rhine very unhealthy. Patrols of low-flying American fighter bombers sweep up and down, gunning and bombing. And the Germans are worried over this threat to the industrially vital Rhineland and Ruhr. For the first time since D-Day, the Luftwaffe has been ordered up to fight off the aggressive American planes, to try to keep our pilots from cutting all the German communications with the Rhineland. But even though they're fighting over their German fatherland, the Luftwaffe cannot prevent those white-starred American planes from slashing at everything that moves in the Rhineland. This is Larry Lister returning you now to Admiral in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a message from Admiral Corporation.
When the war is won, you and many thousands of other American homemakers are going to make a wonderful discovery. When you see the new Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator, you'll discover that out-of-season fruits and vegetables need no longer be a luxury, that you can buy food in bulk at big savings and store it safely for months. All this will be possible because the Admiral refrigerator will have a huge home freezer that will freeze foods for long storage, will keep commercially frozen foods perfectly, and will actually make meats more tender. And the roomy, moist, cold compartment eliminates the need for covered dishes. Foods will not dry out, but will stay crisp and fresh. This regular compartment is so much roomier because the space-stealing coils are gone. And naturally, with the frost-collecting coils gone, there won't be the regular messy job of defrosting. There are other outstanding features, too, in the Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator. For example, there's Sterilamp, with its amazing ultraviolet ray action to reduce spoilage. And the new Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator will be beautiful, newly styled to grace the finest kitchens. 6 years of consumer acceptance and approval before the war makes the Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator a fit companion for Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Douglas Edwards.
The Germans have not yet told their people that Aachen has surrendered unconditionally. But now for a report from the First Army front, Admiral takes you to Belgium, Richard C. Hottelet reporting.
Standing by, Columbia. The thing that's probably aroused most general interest on the American First Army front today has been the number of buzz bombs that came over on their way west. They've taken our attention for a moment off the actual line of battle and focused it on the bigger picture. Right now, as far as we're concerned, we're in the quiet period between two operations. But we're not playing this game of war alone, and it's good to keep an eye on the Germans. We know that the enemy has been very busy also these last 6 weeks since we first broke the Siegfried Line. He's done his utmost to strengthen his defenses with forced civilian labor digging new gun emplacements and anti-tank ditches. His engineers have even built some new concrete fortifications between us and the Rhine. More German troops have been brought up, infantry, armor, engineers, artillery. And they've been used, and partly exhausted, in almost daily small counterattacks against our key positions. The idea there was the typical German principle of the aggressive defense. The basic plan was to gain time. And when several thousand German troops were told to hold off until the last man, the enemy started propaganda about the so-called bridgehead of Aachen, while Himmler and the other higher commanders sent pep telegrams into the doomed city. But no one said what they wanted to gain time for, except vague promises of new divisions and new weapons that would appear if Germany held out until winter. A major of police, a typical SS man whom we caught in Aachen, has admitted to us that the Gestapo was tightening the screws on the officers' corps also to prolong the agony. He said that stern reprisals had been threatened against the family of any officer who now surrendered in violation of order. The doodlebugs that came over today are no more effective than they've ever been. The new People's Divisions don't look like much. If Hitler wants to keep us from breaking through at least to the Rhine, he'd better produce something really new and much better in a hurry. This is Richard C. Hottelet with the American First Army in Belgium, returning you now to Admiral in New York.
Prime Minister Churchill has returned to Britain from his Moscow conferences with Marshal Stalin. For a summary of the news reaching Britain, Admiral takes you to CBS London. Charles Shaw reporting.
Mr. Churchill is back in London after his 10-day conference with Marshal Stalin in Moscow. It was announced about an hour ago that the Prime Minister landed at an airfield near London today. He left Moscow on Thursday, and it isn't known at the moment where he has been the last 2 days. The Prime Minister arrived in the uniform of an Air Commodore, and those who were at the airfield said he looked fit and well. If the comments of London newspaper writers are any criterion, Mr. Churchill may well be hailed as a conquering hero when he makes his next public appearance. The newspaper stories, devoid of any amount of detail, are enthusiastic about the conference, especially about the cordiality between Mr. Churchill and Marshal Stalin. One writer says the two statesmen decided that the war in Europe should be concluded this winter. Well, winter won't be over before the end of next March, and naturally any war leaders who get together plan for the end of the war as soon as possible. Reports of the Churchill-Stalin cordiality, combined with news of Allied successes in all theaters of war, no matter how limited, have returned optimism to Britain. For most of this week, we've been hearing reports that there is turmoil inside Germany. During the last week, the British man on the street has been more optimistic about the end of the war than he was a few weeks ago. And yet the horrid news we get is that the Germans are fighting like savages wherever they feel that bitter defense is necessary. And those men who have been in action with the Germans may be dreaming of a white Christmas, but not at home or in a post-armistice area. I return you now to Admiral.
The British broom sweeping the Germans out of the Aegean has reached the northern extremity with a landing on the strategic island of Limnos, guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles. A Royal Navy communique announced today the capture of the port of Mudros on the south coast of the island after a fierce 30-hour battle. 400 prisoners were taken. Limnos has an area of 150 square miles. Marshal Stalin announces new progress by the Red Army in Hungary. For details, Admiral takes you now to CBS Moscow, George Morad reporting.
This week, the people of Russia have been told, perhaps more thoroughly than ever before, about the problems and prospects of the post-war world, and optimism is high. While the depressing Polish question is still in flux, the people here know that Marshal Stalin broke all precedent in his personal friendship for Mr. Churchill. But he sat with him in the Emperor's box at the Bolshoi Theater, dined at the British Embassy, and went out in the rain at the airport to see him off. No one doubts that in the light of personal friendship, the bonds were greatly strengthened between these two strangely dissimilar characters. This thought, the desperate need for two-way friendship and understanding, ran constantly through the old Prime Minister's words that Anglo-American-Russian friendship can save the world. Given this friendship between powerful leaders, it becomes then a question of how well understanding penetrates through the bureaucracy of dissimilar governments. The official organs seem to reflect an atmosphere of hope, as distinct from compromise. His vesture says unanimity has been achieved on questions on all the Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, joint action in Yugoslavia, and even the special problem of Greece. This dangerous peninsula, this powder keg of Europe, they say here, is going to be blown out like a match in the wind. But consider the latest issue of war and the working classes, explaining how Russia insists on her theory of world security league, that each and every member of the Big Four or Five must agree, even when the problem affects one or more of them. It's difficult to forget, the article says, that not a single member of the League proposed to expel Poland for the capture of Vilna, Italy for Abyssinia, but found it necessary, though, to expel the Soviet Union for depriving Germany of a vital springboard. Of course, during the present war, our prestige has grown enormously. Our power, resistance, and role in Europe provoked the admiration of entire mankind. But even now, prejudice against us is very much alive. Part of the press, even in Allied countries, and about 20 states, possible members of the World Security Organization, haven't found time to establish normal diplomatic relations, thus openly displaying their unfriendly attitude toward the Soviet Union. This is George Morad in Moscow. Now back to Admiral Radio, New York.
And now for a summary of the European picture as viewed from Spain, Admiral takes you to CBS Madrid, Ann Stadler reporting.
Considerable concern is expressed here today over the so-called Spanish Reds, who for 3 weeks have been making raids from France into Spain. A Spanish news report, Dateland Irun, says that the situation continues to be agitated because of infiltrations of what it terms communists and anarchists. These groups are said to be armed with guns dropped months ago from Allied planes to the Maquis for use against the Germans. They made their first large-scale raid on October 4th in the Pyrenees frontier province of Navarre. 600 or 700 Spaniards who had been living in France since the end of the Spanish Civil War came over the mountains. They succeeded in getting quantities of food and cattle before being driven out by regular Franco troops. There were losses on both sides. Today's news report claims that in the latest skirmish, presumably fought in the past few days, the invading Spaniards lost about 100 killed and about the same number of captured. It also says that the raiders passed through the frontier villages in a decidedly revolutionary manner. They distributed propaganda leaflets and shouted, "Viva Gil Robles!" Gil Robles, now living in Portugal, was a conservative political leader during the Republic. 2 of the raiders sneaked into the little fishing port of Fuenterrabía, within sight of the Spanish military commander's headquarters, and sailed away in a small boat. According to the news report, however, the French authorities at Bayonne ordered the boat returned to Spain.
That was Ann Stadler in Madrid. And now for an interview with Rear Admiral Cochrane of the Navy's new assault shipping program, Admiral takes you to Washington. Joe McCaffrey reporting.
History's greatest armada has been assembled in the Pacific to speed the invasion of the Philippines. During the past week, we have seen put into large-scale operation the pattern for amphibious operations we have worked out after striking and winning smaller islands in the Pacific. Today as our guest, we have Rear Admiral E.L. Cochrane, Chief of the Bureau of Ships. Admiral Cochrane was present at the Palau operations, and he has just returned from 6 weeks' inspection in the Pacific area. Admiral, you saw the Palau operations from the minute the transport set out until our troops stormed ashore. Suppose you tell us briefly about what made the greatest impression on you out there.
I was most impressed by 2 things. First, the perfect coordination of the tremendous forces needed for the operation, and secondly, by the suitability and the reliability of the ships and craft which took part in the landing. In the Palau operation, our LSTs had to start out to the objective days before the main convoy.
Then your LSTs were at Peleliu days ahead of the main naval forces.
Not at all. As a result of the careful planning which had been done, each group of our forces arrived at the scene as it was needed. The LSTs needed the head start because of their slower speed. But there is no escaping the fact, now that we are on the offensive, that the enormous distances in the Pacific theater constitute a great advantage on the side of the Japs.
In view of that fact, Admiral, what are we doing here at home to help overcome that advantage?
We hope to overcome it by spanning the Pacific with a bridge of ships, especially assault ships. Right now, the biggest shipbuilding job we have is the program of assault shipping, APAs and AKAs, which the Navy is carrying on as a joint operation with the Maritime Commission.
Admiral, what are APAs and AKAs?
The APAs, attack troop transports, carry what we call the combat teams. That is, complete units of Marines or Army troops fully equipped for battle. These ships are designed to provide accommodations for the troops and at the same time carry the landing craft and tank gliders needed to get the troops and their equipment to the beaches. The AKAs, attack cargo ships, carry the extra ammunition, vehicles, gasoline, food, medical supplies. In other words, all the equipment and supplies required to keep the combat units going until they have gained a firm toehold on the enemy territory. They're combat loaded, so that the equipment needed first can be unloaded first. For example, tanks and jeeps are loaded last and come out first. You know, it's estimated that from 5 to 10 tons of equipment and supplies must be landed for every fighting Marine or soldier who hits the beach.
How do these craft operate during an amphibious assault?
The assault ships operate as part of a task force, of which they are the heart, since the successful landing of the troops and weapons and supplies which they carry constitutes the whole point of the amphibious operation. For their protection, task groups of fighting ships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers go up with the APAs and AKAs to the area of attack. The latter stand offshore, while the big guns and planes of the warships soften up the enemy with a powerful naval and aerial bombardment. Then, after the initial waves of attacking troops have landed in the smaller landing craft, the APAs and AKAs move in toward the beach to facilitate disembarking more men and supplies and equipment.
How is the assault shipbuilding program progressing?
Unfortunately, the job is now lagging behind schedule, due mainly to a lack of manpower. We simply do not have as many workers engaged on the program as we would like to have. If we are going to meet the timetable which has been set up for the operations in the Pacific, every man and woman who is working in this program will have to carry a heavier load to make up for the additional workers who are needed, but whom we've been unable to obtain. This program is the real key to early success in the war in the Pacific.
I'm sure, Admiral, that with the Navy's guidance, we'll keep them floating. This is Joe McCaffrey in Washington. I return you to Admiral in New York.
For a last-minute summary of the war situation, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
A bulletin just received here at Columbia World News Headquarters tells us that Canadian troops today captured Breskins in the Skeld Pocket, which is the only port remaining by which the German troops in that pocket can be reinforced. Also, other forces north of Antwerp took the town of Eschen, 4 miles below the important road junction of Rosendahl. The Berlin radio tells us that Germans have made an important new retreat before the massive Russian forces in East Prussia's hotly contested Romanten area. This Berlin report says that German lines south of the Romanter Plain and in Romanter Forest were withdrawn and an enemy breakthrough was averted. Of course, the Russians haven't told us anything about these advances in East Prussia, which the Germans have been reporting for several days, but the Russians frequently do hold back on those things. Meanwhile, the German radio tells us in a broadcast picked up by CBS shortwave listening station that today is the first day of registration for the so-called Volkssturm, or People's Army. The Berlin station says that the crowds were so great that some of the registration centers had to close at noon. It does seem a little curious that the centers had to close down because there were so many applicants. It sounds like the Central American volunteers who were sent in with the message, please send back the ropes. Now here's Warren Sweeney.
After the war, Admiral Radio, America's smart set, will offer many improvements and refinements over pre-war instruments. There'll be fuller, more beautiful tone and finer reception made completely noise-free by FM.
I know, Mr. Sweeney, that the Admiral is a wonderful radio. But in my new radio, I want a really beautiful piece of furniture.
Then by all means, you'll want an Admiral. You'll have a wide choice of models, each superbly styled in beautiful woods, from the most modern to the period type. Yes, you may rest assured your new Admiral will be a beautiful piece of furniture.
Well, that sounds fine, Mr. Sweeney. But tell me this. I'm also interested in a radio phonograph with an automatic record changer. Will I be able to get one that's really foolproof? I have a 6-year-old at home who gets into everything, and I'm a bit afraid of what his mischievous little fingers may do.
You needn't be, not with an Admiral. The post-war Admiral record changer will be so sturdy in construction, so simple in operation, you might even call it child-proof. As you know, Admiral is the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. Yes, tomorrow's radio phonograph sensation is sure to be an Admiral. For over a full year, the rise in the cost of living has virtually been stopped in its tracks simply because the great majority of American people have cooperated wholeheartedly with our government's anti-inflation program. But the danger of war-generated inflation is still too great to permit any relaxation in our efforts now. Buy only what you need. And when you buy, pay no more than ceiling prices. Pay your ration points in full. Put your extra dollars into war bonds and other savings. By helping to hold down prices today, you can help ensure a stable, prosperous America when the war is won. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set, and post-war makers of Admiral Refrigerators, Admiral Home Freezers, Admiral Electric Ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago 11.
World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of Admiral distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards.
A United Press dispatch reported a few minutes ago that Allied troops have cleared the key city of Breda in southwestern Holland of all enemy forces except a few scattered snipers, and the Germans are retreating across the Maas River. This morning, strong groups of British and American bombers flew over Sweden, apparently en route to give aid to the Finnish and Russian troops in northern Finland. The Germans say 4 Soviet armies have begun a large-scale offensive in Latvia, and Berlin radio claims the Allies have landed on the Greek island of Melos in the Aegean. And now for news from the headquarters of our Pacific Fleet and an interview with the first wave to arrive in Honolulu. Admiral takes you to CBS Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
Fleet Headquarters is readying a report on the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. But at this hour, the details are still in the mill, as we say. All reports coming from the battle area, however, indicate that this naval battle was a blazing, thundering affair. And it is definitely certain that the United States forces were victorious, that the Japanese were routed, broken, and badly defeated. During the high activity here at Fleet Headquarters these past eventful days have been some very interested and very busy officers of the Navy's Women's Reserve. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Joy Bright Hancock of Wildwood, New Jersey, is our guest for a brief minute. Commander Hancock, this is an exciting time to be here.
Indeed it is. I've known and watched many of those boys out there while they were growing their wings back home.
I understand you are one of the 2 waves wearing the First World War ribbon. You were a yeomanette then, right?
That's correct.
Was I in order calling you a wave?
Yes.
Officially, it's Women's Reserve. And what is your title?
Got your breath?
Yep.
Women's Reserve Representative for the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air and the Bureau of Aeronautics.
Well, I got that every word. Now, you're here, Commander Hancock, and Lieutenant Commander Gene Palmer, to survey needs and facilities for the first waves out in this part of the world. When may we expect them, by the way?
A few of the first officers will arrive soon. And we hope the enlisted personnel will begin arriving in December. As you know, only those who request overseas duty will be given consideration for services out here.
They'll relieve enlisted men?
More than that. The waves will, in general, be new personnel to fill new jobs created by increasing duties in this area. They will be assigned to all activities that can use them, shore establishments first, such as control tower operators, aviation machinist mates, supply corps, and so on.
The waves have already contributed much toward winning the war by their work on the mainland, Commander. I know that everyone out here is well pleased that they'll be extending their activities out into the Pacific.
We hope so, and every wave will do her utmost. You may be sure of that.
You have heard Lieutenant Commander Joy Bright Hancock of the Women's Reserve, United States Navy. And thank you, Commander. This is Webley Edwards at Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor.
And this is Phil Woodyard in San Francisco. No job seems too hopeless for Tokyo Radio to tackle. These past few days, Japan's propagandists have been trying to turn a trick which would make even Dr. Goebbels turn pale with anxiety. Tokyo's claims of a fabulous naval victory off the Philippines were cooked up largely to boost the sagging morale on the Japanese home front. And according to Tokyo, the factories really hummed for a while. But the Jap leaders are now in a bad spot. To avoid being exposed for the blatant liars they are, they've got to say something like this to the people at home. We won a glorious victory in this naval battle, they say, and we destroyed most of the American fleet. But the war situation is even more serious than it was before. The Americans, they say, will soon replace the lost fleet. Perhaps the precision-trained Japanese people can follow their leaders through this painful hodgepodge, but you'd think that the present crisis in the Tokyo cabinet would be a dead giveaway. You'll recall that General Tojo was finished off as prime minister by the American conquest of Saipan. And now General Koiso, the present prime minister, has been all but finished off by the Japanese defeats in and around the Philippines. Here's what happened. As soon as the full story of Japan's losses became known, a group of Japanese leaders, dressed in the traditional top hats and cutaway coats, called on His Majesty the Emperor. Prime Minister Koiso was not among them. When they came out, Koiso found that he had an even dozen of new advisors, each with the rank of minister. And Tokyo says that these men will have the power to advise not only on economic matters, but on material and spiritual matters as well, which just about covers everything. Both Tojo and Koiso are men of the Kwantung Army, that powerful group of militarists who rule Manchuria and who also ruled Japan in Tojo's day. But no Kwantung leaders are in this new board of advisors. In fact, the only Army officer in the lot is a harmless, retired 80-year-old general. As for the rest, there's one old admiral, 4 industrialists, a couple of politicians, a banker, a farm expert, a university president, and a newspaper publisher. These are the new leaders of Japan. It's clear that with nothing to its credit but a series of defeats, which have been getting worse and worse, the Kwantung Group is just about all washed up in Tokyo. But this doesn't mean that all these civilians are a peace group. The powers they represent have been trying to push into the government ever since Pearl Harbor, and they didn't like Tojo's one-man army rule. Tojo's defeat at Saipan let some of them in. Koiso's defeat in the Philippines has pushed the door wide open. Japan will simply try a new system now. Tokyo calls it a rejuvenation of the government. These new rulers will try very hard to fight the war better, and they'll try to keep everybody happy by giving all groups a voice in the cabinet. But about the only thing that could keep them in for long would be the destruction of the Allied navies, and that's not likely to happen. I return you to Admiral in New York.
News from Europe in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a message from Admiral Corporation.
Perhaps you've wondered why Admiral Radio is called America's Smart Set. Well, one of the very good reasons is the smart styling and lasting beauty that have always been a tradition in building Admiral cabinets. The performance of Admiral radios has always been smartly up to date and very often ahead of the field because of the long list of Admiral firsts. When you see all of the After Victory Admiral models, the consoles and table models, the farm sets and portables, the bantams, and the various models of radio phonographs with automatic record changers, when you learn about Admiral's FM, television, and home recording, you're going to agree that any one of these grand radios is indeed America's Smart Set. Admiral Corporation is the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. This fact alone is convincing proof of Admiral's nationwide popularity. Post-war, Admiral will be prepared to give America an improved radio phonograph with a revolutionary new automatic record changer that is destined to make music appreciation history. Yes, you can rest assured that intelligent buyers, those quality and value-conscious people all over America, will again choose Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set. Now, here once again is Douglas Edwards.
And for a summary of developments on the Western Front, Admiral takes you to Paris. Larry Lasser reporting.
The weather was a lot better over the Western Front today, and the break in the weather came at a good time for us. Swarms of Allied fighter bombers took to the air to help the British and Canadians drive against the crumbling German defenses north of Antwerp. British troops fighting north of Antwerp over the soggy bogs of Holland are driving the Germans back from one position to another. But the Germans are fighting back bitterly to avoid being pinned down against the almost bridgeless River Maas. The enemy has left a good-sized pocket of troops to fight a rearguard action between Hertogenbosch and Tilburg. There's no sign of a planned German withdrawal, but they're being battered from pillar to post. The position of this rearguard pocket shows that the Germans still hope to swing their front back to the River Maas and thus avoid being cut to pieces before they can get there. It's obvious that the Germans fear that the British drive in Holland will irretrievably break the blockade of the port of Antwerp. Indications of these fears came in 4 spirited German counterattacks launched in the past 3 days from the other side of the battlefield, the east, against the troops protecting the British eastern flank. A German battle group of some 500 men, supported by 30 or so tanks, made a powerful surge across the canal north of Maastricht and drove the Allied troops back up to 1,500 yards in some places on a 10-mile front. A funny thing, one of the German counterblows sprang from the vicinity of a little Dutch town called America. It's clear the purpose of these heavy German counterattacks is to divert reinforcements away from the successfully driving British troops on the opposite side of the big salient in Holland. Meanwhile, the Allied air effort to break all German railroad communications in the Ruhr and Rhineland was carried on with increased determination today. American Thunderbolt bombers flew all the way into the eastern Ruhr to bomb the railroads. Others smashed a railroad bridge in the Cologne plain between Düren and the shattered city of Cologne. And returning pilots reported that Cologne is still burning after our recent overwhelming air raids. And this is Larry LeSueur returning you now to Admiral in New York.
For a direct report from the American First Army front, Admiral takes you to Belgium. Ned Calmer reporting.
This is a story that typifies the situation behind the American lines in Germany today. It's a story that has its humorous as well as serious aspects. You might entitle it, A Town in Search of a Mayor. For more than a week now, the city of Aachen has been officially in American hands. All resistance has ceased, and the defending garrison has formally surrendered. The battle lines have moved eastward beyond the city. What fighting there is during this period of lull is taking place well outside, and nobody in his right mind would bet that Aachen will ever be recaptured by the Nazi High Command. Nevertheless, it's been impossible so far to find a citizen of Aachen who's willing to become mayor of the newly occupied city, the mayor of the first sizable German city under Allied occupation. Our military authorities have been trying hard to locate somebody fitted for the post who's willing to accept it. A number of candidates have been offered the chance to qualify, but they don't want the job. And though some of them are less articulate than others, the general drift of their remarks is clear. Nazism, the Nazi regime, still holds a strong and sinister sway over the occupied portion of Germany, even though that influence is exercised, so to speak, by remote control. German civilians will cooperate with us as long as it's more or less unofficial cooperation. But apparently, they have as yet no leader willing to risk the torturing or death of his relatives by becoming the first non-Nazi mayor of a German city. We're going to keep on trying till we find one. This is Ned Calmer with the American First Army, returning you now to Admiral in New York.
For additional news on Britain and the Battle of Europe, Admiral takes you to CBS London. Eric Severide reporting.
Today, London's press gives great headlines to the story of General Stilwell's recall from China. So far, there is no attempt at explanation. Real knowledge here of the problem in China is confined to a small circle. There has never been in England the same emotional feeling about China there was in America. There has never been any real indication from the British government that it believed China could contribute very much to the defeat of Japan and was therefore worth a serious reinforcement effort. That effort has been American, and it was obvious in Chongqing that Stilwell was a driving force behind it. He struggled relentlessly. He had to work with men to whom form, face, and favor were everything, and for that he had no time. Whatever his quarrels with Chinese leaders, and they are not a new development, there were many intelligent Chinese there who looked upon him as their country's greatest friend. For he believed two things passionately: that Japan must be defeated on the soil of China, and that the Chinese army, despite its state of inefficiency, could be hammered into an effective fighting force. That was his mission and his dream. Yet he found himself in a position where every military proposal had to be considered by the Chinese in the light of its political effect upon the status of the Chinese communists, or this provincial governor, or that local warlord. Stilwell is simple and direct, not only in speech but in action. And it is impossible to move in straight lines when you find yourself in a labyrinth. Very little of the complex China story is known to the British people, perhaps not so much more to Americans. But nearly all Americans in China, both military and civilian, did believe that the whole situation should have been explained long ago. Some reporters, including this one, have tried. They found themselves censored and stopped by the War Department in Washington for what it believed were considerations of military security, by the State Department for what it called diplomatic reasons. In most battle theaters, Allied leaders have the comfort of knowing that their people at home have some appreciation of their problems. Those leaders in China have not. This is Eric Severide in London. I return you now to Admiral.
It's still a very slow and very tough fight on the Italian battlefields. For a summary of the latest developments, Admiral takes you to CBS Rome, Farnsworth Fowle reporting.
The Italian front has been under the influence of bad weather, and there isn't much change to report. The Canadians have moved ahead a bit on the west coast, the Brazilians on the west coast. The American advance elements have been withdrawn from what are called exposed positions on Mount Mazzano. The Air Force was mostly grounded again. Some light bombers crossed the Adriatic to attack shipping on the Dalmatian coast. They had to drop their bombs through the clouds. A small force of B-17s went to Klagenfurt in Austria to bomb an aircraft factory. It was the same story there. But late yesterday afternoon, the weather cleared over northwestern Italy, and P-47 fighter bombers made the most of their opportunity, claiming 17 locomotives, 33 cars, and 36 motor vehicles destroyed. That's a pretty good average for only 65 sorties. The British, moving north in Greece, have pushed their way along the highway where it swings inland past Mount Olympus of the gods. Advancing 60 miles northwest from Larissa, they've brought artillery to bear on the German rearguards in Kozani. The big port of Salonika is 70 miles away to the northeast, and the frontier of Yugoslavia is only 40 miles north of Kozani. By the sound of it, the British have crossed the river Aliakmon and have entered that traditional Balkan no man's land, Macedonia. It isn't really a country or a nationality. Greek Macedonia is pretty thoroughly Greek by this time. But further north, across the border of Yugoslavia, Serbian and Bulgarian influence have been at odds for 60 years. It looks as though the first junction of British and Red Army ground forces would take place in this area.
That was Farnsworth Fowle in Rome. And now for an interview with the Chief of the Field Service, Army Ordnance, just back from a 20,000-mile trip in the Pacific. Admiral takes you to CBS Washington. Joe McCaffrey reporting.
When giving credit to our forces fighting in all parts of the world, there may sometimes be a tendency to overlook the work which is done by the service units of the Army. One such valuable organization is the Army Ordnance. Today, as our guest, we have the man who took Detroit to the fighting fronts, a man who is in charge of one of the largest assembly lines with headquarters in such out-of-the-way places as jungles and battle-scarred Pacific Islands. Incidentally, although this man today is an officer in the United States Army, he is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. He is Brigadier General Julian S. Hatcher, Chief of Field Service for the Army Ordnance. The General has just returned from a 20,000-mile inspection trip of ordnance field installations in the Pacific, including those which were our farthest west before General MacArthur's troops invaded the Philippines. On this trip, General Hatcher had an excellent opportunity to see firsthand the work of our ordnance soldiers under rugged battle conditions. But first, General, I understand that you did a little investigating of Japanese propaganda over there, too.
Yes, I found that the Japanese soldier in this war thinks he is fighting in Texas and California. Those captured Japanese I talked to all think they were defeated in Texas, but they defiantly claim other Japanese are carrying on victoriously in California. No matter what the island is, the Jap soldier apparently is told that it is part of the United States, almost always Texas. This conviction of the enemy soldier struck me as one of the most amazing evidences of propaganda used by the Japanese to indoctrinate their fighting men. It doesn't make sense, but neither does their fanatical willingness to commit suicide rather than be captured when they are cornered by our forces.
I understand that you found the ordnance men have devised a way to make the enemy feel his own steel.
Yes, we found that the Japanese 81-millimeter mortar shell will fit our mortars. It is not as good a shell as ours, but it fits perfectly. Now, every time our forces come on an ammunition dump which contains these shells, they send them right back to the Japs.
Suppose you tell us about the work of ordnance as you observed it in the battle zones, General.
Our men go right in with the assault forces when they land in order to keep the guns in firing conditions, and the tanks which arrive in the early waves moving towards the objectives. But what impressed me most is how the big ordnance bases move ahead as we move closer to Japan. When we see the islands further west, we move every bit of Army material off the islands in the rear areas and bring them to the new front. Every piece of lumber, every shed, every tool, to have them at the actual scene of operations.
What does this repair work consist of?
We make use of every tire that can possibly be saved, for instance. We have large, well-equipped tire shops which retread and rebuild tires damaged in battle. Our trucks are shipped, crated, and stripped down in order to conserve valuable shipping space. Therefore, we have assembly lines fashioned after the time-saving devices used in industry. Uncrating is done by machinery, and in a matter of minutes, the parts are unpacked and sent along our wilderness assembly line to be put together. After that, they are tested before being sent to the troops.
In the present Philippine invasion, General, how are the repairs carried out?
Right now on Leyte Island, ordnance supplies are going ashore and establishment of our big ordnance bases is underway. But before they are completed, all the work that can be done will be done by small groups of men working with whatever tools and spare parts they are able to carry on their persons or in small trucks. The bigger jobs will be left for the repair bases to take care of when they are completely supplied with new parts and machinery.
This on-the-spot repair work must be paying dividends.
It is. First of all, it saves valuable shipping space. For every tank, gun, or truck we can put back in Class A condition, there's one less that will have to be brought to the scene by ship, thus leaving room for food and other supplies and equipment. Then, too, it makes for greater efficiency for our fighting forces and helps pay off in lives saved. All this, plus the fact it saves money.
You've seen the enemy's equipment at the scene of battle. How does it stack up with ours?
We can't underestimate the Japanese equipment, but ours is much superior. That is why we're able to repair and salvage so much of it. Our men and women on the production line are doing an excellent job, and if they could see the results of their work after it has been through combat, they would, I'm sure, feel a deep sense of pride.
You have just heard Brigadier General Julian S. Hatcher, Chief of Field Service for the Army Ordnance. This is Joe McCaffrey in Washington. I return you to Admiral in New York.
Here's a bulletin just in from headquarters of the 1st Canadian Army in Holland. American troops are now fighting under 1st Canadian Army Command. They've captured several villages, and all of Breda, except the northern portion, has been cleared by Polish troops. A Berlin broadcast announced the evacuation of the communications hub of Oce, 34 miles southwest of Jelgava in Latvia today. That stands on a main rail line between Riga, Jelgava, and the Baltic port of Lipaia and controls roads running westward. But when Latvia is finally cleaned up, the Russians will accomplish three things: removal of a threat to their flank as they drive on East Prussia, release of a considerable number of divisions for employment against East Prussia or elsewhere, and a very considerable shortening of their front, thus simplifying their supply and transport situation. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral.
Maybe you think you've seen some attractive kitchen stoves, but you haven't seen anything until you've viewed the newly styled, gleaming white and chromium beauty of the post-war Admiral electric ranges. There's an old saying that beauty is only skin deep. Well, there are so many exclusive features built right into the new Admiral electric ranges that you will quickly agree their beauty goes all the way through. But you'll have to see them to appreciate them. Take, for example, the Admiral 5-way timer. This miraculous timer is simply beautiful in its operation. It makes automatically timed cooking possible in the oven, in the complete meal cooker, the surface units, or the cooker and one surface unit in combination. You can automatically time any appliance, too, such as a coffee pot that you plug into the convenience outlet. No timer has ever been so easy and so simple to set as the Admiral 5-way timer. We know that most of you will agree to the many advantages of electric cookery, such as cleanliness, coolness, convenience, speed, safety, economy, and healthfulness. You know it's the modern method of meal preparation, and practically everyone knows of the leadership of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. So when you see the beauty and years-ahead features of the Admiral electric ranges, you'll agree that Admiral has done it again. It's another Admiral first. We should all buy more and more war bonds and hold them. True, the war news from all fronts has been good. But the more our armies are on the offensive, the greater the need for the supplies that our war bonds buy. Not one of us can slacken our efforts now. Let's buy them and hold them till the job is done. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set, and post-war makers of Admiral dual-temp refrigerators, Admiral home freezers, Admiral electric ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
This is the WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago 11.